Mr. Warner, what are the main challenges for children who are lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender, or have parents who are LGBT?
Well, the main challenges, and I'm thinking of the education system and schools in this context, well, there's a variety of them. The first is that they experience a homophobic environment or a transphobic environment. So whether they are openly lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender, or not open at all, they find themselves in an environment where there is a lot of negativity and hostility. And there was recently, a few years, 3 or 4 years ago, one of the major UK organisations working for LGBT people did a survey of 1,000 LGBT kids in schools. And they have a number of very interesting factors. One was that something like close to 100% of LGBT children had heard and experienced homophobic comment, attacks, other things on other people, for example. So even if they aren't openly LGBT, they're in, generally speaking, a negative environment. That's the first point. If they are identified as LGBT, or indeed even if they are not LGBT, but are perceived by others to be lesbian, gay or bisexual or transgender, then they can also, they can have problems one way or the other, and then they can find themselves being bullied. And this particular survey found that something like 65% of the children in the survey had experienced bullying of one kind or another. And then in state school, in faith schools, that rose to 75%. So there's a very high level of hostility that actually is experienced by these children when they actually come out, and young people when they come out. So that's the first thing. So they find themselves bullied and they find themselves isolated, and very often they find themselves with a lack of support. And that leads to a second problem, which is that by and large teachers don't know how to handle homophobic bullying. And again, in this survey, only 30-something, no, less than 25%, I think, of the teachers had actually been told that homophobic bullying was wrong. So they didn't actually necessarily perceive it to be wrong. And where something like this is culturally institutionalized, it becomes like the wallpaper. It becomes something that people don't see anymore, and they don't perceive it, and they don't understand it, and they just think it's part of normal growing up behaviour. And so that becomes a very serious problem. So these children find themselves without support and in a world which doesn't even recognise the problem they're facing and the challenges they face. So that's the experience of the bullying. Then a third problem which ties in with that and the notion of a hostile environment is that when it comes to the curricula and what they're being taught, they're not being taught anything that's relevant to their identity in the sense of their being lesbian or gay or trans. That means that the curricula at best are simply empty. There's nothing in the curriculum about it, and so a very important part of their lives is simply not reflected in terms of the information they're getting, or positive role models that they're getting, or anything like that. At worst, of course, it can be negative or homophobic, because some teachers take a negative viewpoint, some or express things negatively, or are uncomfortable with sexual orientation and gender identity issues. So, but in some cases it can go worse. And of course, we're talking Europe as a whole now. In many parts of Europe, from the information that we get in ILGA-Europe, there is still quite frequently negative and hostile material in education. And that's the case, obviously particularly the case, unfortunately, in many faith schools, of which there are a very large number in some European countries. There is indeed actually one important case under the European Social Charter, which involved a case brought by the organisation Interrights against Croatia, because the official Croatian educational material included what were described by the European Social Charter Committee as very negative, hostile and degrading comments about LGBT people in the educational material. So it is a serious problem. It's one that's recognised in the jurisprudence of the Council of Europe as being an issue, and the question of curricula as an issue, and of course this impacts very negatively on these young people. And then there's a another category we need to think of, which you've asked me about, and that's the children of LGBT parents. And I think the answer is that they probably experience the same sort of difficulties, possibly on a lesser scale, and possibly because there are not so many of them, I suspect, this is not such a prominent issue, but I'm sure that and would believe that once their parents are identified as being same-sex, then it's quite possible that they would experience bullying or negative comments or some kind of harassment. And then there's a fourth category we haven't dealt with specific needs, and that's of course transgender children. And they can have very specific problems if their school is not sympathetic to the way in which they perceive their gender identity. So if you have the case of a child who is born as a boy, identified as a boy at birth, but perceives herself to be a girl, and wishes to present as a girl, or vice versa, then what is common is that schools don't support that, and that then not only is this child victimized by other students, but it's also victimized by the teachers and the school itself. And so this can be a very major problem. There's indeed a case going to the European Court of Human Rights at the moment regarding a Croatian young man who started life as a girl and wished to present as a boy, and was refused that possibility both by the school and by the state authorities. And so he's challenging this denial of his rights at the European Court of Human Rights with the support of his mother, with the complete support of his mother and others. So it is a problem which is emerging more and more. The transgender problems are emerging more and more as people become more familiar with transgender issues, and as transgender people become more determined to assert their rights and to determine their autonomy and determine who they are, and not have the state or the church or their schools tell them who they are. So that's an issue which also for those children.
Tell me, what can be done to combat discrimination against LGBT children?
Well, there's a variety of things that can be, there's a whole range of things that can be done. The first thing, of course, is to tackle bullying, and that means it's got to be done in the round. So schools have to adopt equality policies, non-discrimination policies, diversity policies. They have to have diversity awareness raising, and this, of course, benefits. This is not just for LGBT kids, but it's got to be, for all diverse groups. So the first thing is to create an environment that's positive and constructive and accepts different people and difference. The second thing then is to have explicit anti-bullying and anti-discrimination policies. And again, those must cover all grounds. This is not just for LGBT kids, because of course bullying is a common problem in many other areas as well. The third thing I think is that they have to have some kind of, as it were, conflict resolution framework, so that when children do engage in bullying, or indeed teachers engage in bullying, because one of the distressing things is that quite a lot of the children who've been bullied say that their teachers actually were involved. It wasn't just that they turned a blind eye, they actually were involved. So there needs to be some kind of conflict resolution training process by which those who engage in the bullying are trained and given the opportunity to understand why it is they're doing it, what they're doing. Because often they're doing it from their own insecurity, they're doing it for problems of their own which they're kind of inflicting on others. So those are things that are needed in the immediate area of bullying. Then of course the curricula need to have positive images, positive material in history, or in the arts, or whatever it is that the subject, where it's appropriate and relevant, then there should be reference to the fact that a person was lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. That should just be ordinary and part of the norm, so that these children can feel part of society and part of the training process and teaching process and teaching world that they're in. So that's a second thing. Then teachers need to be trained, because one of the things that's very clear from the Stonewall research is that teachers, as I've said earlier, don't actually know even sometimes that, or haven't been told that this kind of bullying is unacceptable. So there needs to be a training and empowerment of teachers so that they feel that they can step in and support LGBT kids when they're being bullied, and not fear, for example, that somehow some homophobic parent will start screaming at them and complaining that they're doing the wrong thing. So they need support from their head teacher, they need support from the education system, and they need training, and they also need diversity and awareness raising tools. They need materials that they can use, both in teacher training and also amongst the kids. So those I think are very important aspects. And then if we come to transgender kids, there need to be special protocols which enable them to be and present as they feel they are, and not as society or others would tell them they are. And that means that they should be allowed to dress in the gender which they feel they are, adopt a name which they feel they are, and have that support. And both they and the lesbian, gay, bisexual kids, what they all need is the support to live their lives as they are. And it's quite interesting because this has actually, as an issue, gone up to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in evidence brought against the UK, because the UK had a law prohibiting the dissemination of information in state schools on sexual orientation. That was challenged by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which said that children need to be provided with the information necessary for them to live their own lives, to be the person they are. And that is a crucial thing. That's a crucial aspect of it. There must be positive information to support and help them be the person that they are. So that in the round, I think, covers the issues of the challenges that are faced, and also some of the things that can be done. But there are some more things that I should mention. Part of the awareness raising process should involve lesbian and gay and bisexual and transgender people coming to schools and being involved in discussions. And this is a technique and an approach which is adopted in a lot of schools and a lot of education systems now in some European countries. I was hearing only 2 days ago about work in the Strasbourg region in schools. And this is very effective, because what it does is it enables it to be a free, open discussion. The students can express their feelings openly. There can then be a discussion in the schools and in the classes. And what I was hearing is that over the recent years that this has been going on, what the people doing these sessions experience is that more and more this is becoming not so much an issue. And more they ask, how many of you know someone who's lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender? And back come increasing numbers who say, my sister, my brother, my uncle, our neighbours. And so it's having that kind of grassroots approach is having a very significant and important and beneficial effect where it's allowed to be carried out. And then the last thing, which is an American thing, which happens much more in America than in Europe, I think, but which I think is very beneficial, is supporting the establishment in schools of what are called gay-straight alliances. And this is where students, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, who are supportive of LGBT rights, meet together without questions about what their orientation is, but just in a sense as a sort of social and human rights activity to support those who are LGBT. And those have been apparently very effective in the States, and in the countries where they've been adopted or where they've been followed in Europe, they've also been useful. So there's a whole range of practical things that can be done, and most of them are probably rather fun and needn't be threatening or difficult or challenging, and all of them can contribute to an environment, to a school environment, which in fact becomes better for everybody, because everybody then feels more able to be themselves, less bound by social conventions, by stereotypes, by having to always follow the pack. They can be individuals, they can be the people they are, and that's really what it's about.
What can the Council of Europe do to make sure that children victims of this type of discrimination are aware of and have access to effective legal remedies before a national authority?
I think the question of effective legal remedies is rather a technical one. And I have to be quite honest and say I don't know exactly the best approach on that. But in 2010, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe adopted its recommendation on combating sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination. And this is a comprehensive intergovernmental agreement on the measures that are needed to address this discrimination in the short, medium and long term. It's a very comprehensive statement, and it has some very important paragraphs on education. And indeed most of what I've just been talking about comes straight out of those those recommendations, those paragraphs on education. And so I think the first thing that the Council of Europe can do is very strongly to promote the concepts and the measures that are encompassed in those two paragraphs. They're a few short lines, but they're very powerful and very excellent. That means what they oblige is member states to put in place the legislative and other measures needed to stop the bullying and to enable young LGBT people to develop to maturity in their own, as the person they are. And that's the essence of it. So I think that's the first thing that the Council of Europe can do. Beyond that, I think that the whole business of the Council of Europe's programmes on children's rights, anti-bullying rights, I think those are very important places for the Council of Europe to be promoting the kind of things that I've just been talking about, the kind of measures that I've been talking about. Those are soft measures, as are the vast majority of the measures listed in the Committee of Ministers recommendation. The difficulty with what one might call hard legislative measures is that they're not necessarily the right thing to bring into the school. Bringing the criminal court into the schoolroom, into the education system, is very, very much a last resort. One can see it possibly in relation to a teacher who engages in homophobic bullying. That might be something that could be considered. But as between young people, really what is much more important is to try to have dialogue, try to have awareness raising, try to have counselling, those sorts of measures, so that people are helped through the reasons of why they bully people, and then put on a proper track where they can actually accept and be friends with the people who are different from themselves. That, I think, is the way it has to go.
Well, Mr. Warner, thank you very much for sharing with us your experiences, your observations, clarifications, and your very good ideas.
Well, I hope that's useful, and I hope that maybe I can encourage the Council of Europe, because it's a fantastic organisation and it does great work in the face of a lot of opposition, especially on LGBT issues, and so it's a great ally, I think, for LGBT people across Europe, and a very important institution absolutely across Europe. Thank you.